بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة والتسليم على محمد النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه الطيبين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. سبحان الله العلي العظيم، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونسترضيه ونستجيره، فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. اللهم يا علي يا عظيم، اللهم يا رحمن يا رحيم، اصلح لنا ديننا الذي هو عصمة أمرنا، واصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا، واصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا، واجعل الحياة زيادة لنا في كل خير من كل خير، واجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر. It is human nature it is embedded in our intellectual and moral and even spiritual code as human beings that we can recognize harm. We, at a very minimum, respond to what is pleasant and what is unpleasant. And that the nature of our learning is experiential. So much of what we know, or the way we know it, is because we've experienced failure, displeasure, harm, things we've done that had unpleasant consequences. And from that, we then come to a conclusion that a particular act, a particular option, a particular choice is not good because of its unpleasant consequences. And in fact, the vast majority of what defines us is precisely this. Although we like to believe that we mold and engineer ourselves according to principles. This requires a considerable amount of work to mold yourself beyond the experiential, to mold yourself through means of learning, other than simply what you perceive to be pleasant or unpleasant consequences, requires that you place in a secondary status, or that in fact you suspend, you don't give priority to your own personalized experiences of harm or pleasure, and live up to a method and a principle where you say, even if what I experienced is different, or even if I haven't experienced, this is beyond my realm of experiences, I will still believe and still pursue a particular course of action because reason tells me to do so, principles tell me to do so, some deliberative process of thinking, persuading the self, and then living up to what the self had been persuaded of. The reality, though, is that the vast majority of time, for the vast majority of people, we philosophize the experiential. We do not experience the philosophical. For the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, it is whatever they experience in terms of pleasure and displeasure, and then they project that onto society, onto the world, onto everything. They project it so that they philosophize it. Very few people want to admit that really they don't know anything other than what they've experienced in life. And what they've experienced in life is extremely limited. The vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, don't want to admit that the way they know lofty concepts such as justice, love, truth, they only know these concepts, justice, love, truth, through the extremely limited prism of their pleasures and displeasures. In other words, they only know them experientially. Mind you, this is precisely why the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, They can read the Quran and read that the Quran demands that they live testifying for truth, even if it be against themselves. They can read the Quran demanding that they sacrifice their lives, their time, their money for God, for a cause. They can read the Quran and see how the Quran speaks about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the very first generation of Muslims with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. They can read the Quran and read about the sacrifices of generations of prophets. But when all is said and done, the way that the Quran is distilled, the entire universe of the Quran, with all its lofty principles, unless a human being learns to get beyond the self, to assign value according to rational, deliberate processes of thinking, and then to set that value as a goal, and then to organize one's life in service of this value. Unless one is extremely deliberate about it and extremely conscientious about it and extremely careful about it, what ends up happening is that the abstract always retreats to the far background before the experiential. In other words, whatever abstract concepts you're reading in the Quran, whatever abstractions about taking care of the poor, the orphan, the wayfarer, living your lives bearing witness to God, living your life in a state of jihad, sacrificing for the sake of Allah, all of that retreats to some vague notions of correctness, and what comes to the fore, what becomes the living reality of the vast majority of people, the vast majority of time, is that, well, abstraction makes me uncomfortable. Abstraction requires sacrifice. Abstraction requires very hard work. And so whatever I read in the Quran, I will assign a gloss to these principles. And the actual embodiment of what I've read will be my experiential knowledge. In other words, I'll put the Quranic concepts on the shelf, and I'll simply live myself according to a convenient myth that we all embrace. We are essentially fine. We are essentially good. We are essentially okay. Although Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaking to the Prophet ﷺ and his companions. And Allah teaches the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba a very basic and fundamental lesson. وَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ. Don't commend yourself. Don't assume the best of yourself. In other words, don't simply blindly believe that you're okay. Vast majority of time, for the vast majority of people, this is precisely what they do. We're fine. I am fine as a Muslim. I am fine as a human being. I don't live selfishly. I'm not a selfish person. Look, if anything, I'm a very giving person. I'm a caring person. If anything, I think of others. But for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of time, it is an absolute delusion. This is why hypocrisy is part and parcel of the hearts of the vast majority of Muslims for the vast majority of time. In fact, the very plight of Muslims right now is that for hundreds of years, since the crumbling of the Islamic civilization, you see, every civilization has a percentage of people, a small percentage of people that get beyond the self and live in service of an idea or set of ideas. Not all of England became worldwide explorers. But there was a small percentage of people among the English people that dedicated their lives to exploring the world and traveling to remote lands where they put their lives and well-being at risk. Not all the Christian world committed to spreading the gospel, but a small percentage of British, of French, of Dutch sacrificed and dedicated and sacrificed their lives to living in extremely remote lands, in extremely uncomfortable conditions, to spread the gospel of Jesus, of what they believe is the truth. And as a result, Taiwan today is Christian, South Korea is Christian, Japan is Christian, more than half of Africa is Christian. Those people got beyond the experiential and understood quite simply that to live per principle necessarily means forcing the self, putting the self, placing the self in the background and bringing to the forefront the principle itself. Whatever historical mistakes were committed in the trajectory of Islamic history, whatever failures there was always enough of a percentage that was capable of assigning the self to the background and living life according to a principle that is not experienced. There was always enough Ibn Battutas to travel the world. There were always enough Ibn Sina or Farabi to imagine truth. There were always enough Al-Ghazalis or Ibn Rushd to think about justice and beauty and haqq and to pursue them beyond the experiential, to cover over the historical mistakes. Let me put it more simply to you. Shortly after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the Muslim Ummah experienced a truly demonic moment. A demonic moment that in and of itself would have been enough to destroy Islam forever. And that demonic moment was the murder of Al-Husayn, the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, by the political authorities of the day. The first Muslim dynasty commenced its legacy with a truly atrocious and absolutely blasphemous act. They murdered the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ. If you didn't do anything but this, it would be enough to curse you till the end of time. But why was the grandson of the Prophet, Al-Husayn radiallahu anhu, murdered? Yes, the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, at that time, put themselves first. Not the principle, not the Prophet, not the family of the Prophet, not the grandson of the Prophet, not justice, not truth, not beauty. The vast majority of people knew very well that Al-Husayn was the just party, knew very well that they have an obligation to support Al-Husayn, but they betrayed him. And they betrayed principles. And they engaged in the utmost act of selfishness. And because of this betrayal, the first dynasty to rule Islam was an incredibly corrupting force. The Umayyad dynasty, as was the Abbasid dynasty, but we're talking about the Umayyads, did everything within its power to corrupt the ethical revolution that Islam is. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah An-Nisa very explicitly tells us, وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالْمُسْتَضْعَفِينَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ وَالنِّسَاءِ وَالْوِلْدَانِ. Very explicitly tells us, you have an obligation not just to sacrifice, but in fact to go to war, not on your own behalf, not because of your experiential knowledge, not because of your own selfish goals, but to empower the disempowered. The Islam of the Prophet ﷺ and the Islam of Husayn ﷺ, or radiyallahu anhu, wa alayhi salam as well, was an Islam of sacrifice. Islam of constant, you are on this earth to sacrifice. You are on this earth to put yourself in the service of a higher cause. You have no grounds for selfish entitlements. No grounds. But the Umayyad dynasty that murdered the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ understood very well that this is a dangerous Islam. And so they got to work. They invented an enormous amount of hadiths about how you owe an obligation of obedience. People must obey the ruler, even if the ruler is cruel and unjust. Children must obey their parents, even if their parents are unjust. Wives should obey their husbands, even if the husbands are unjust. Slaves should obey their masters, even if the masters are unjust. People just simply need to say, Ashhadu anna la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, and they're fine, they're Muslim. People just need to do their ibadah, and if they do their ibadah, they're taken care of. People don't have to think about what Muhammad himself did, and that is sacrifice his best interest. Sacrifice himself day in and day out. He did it. The stellar companions did it. Ali ibn Abi Talib did it. Al-Husayn did it. And Al-Hassan did it. The Ahlul Bayt, generation after generation, did it. But no, Umayyad Islam said, oh, you can be a Muslim by not following. You don't have to follow what Muhammad did. After all, your body has a right. Your wife has a right. Your children have rights. You know, by the time you get done with giving yourself its right, what's left? What's left? You kid yourself. You say, oh no, I can give myself its right. And I can give my family their right. and then I can give the principles to the right. Well, by the time you get to principles, very little is left. Because the self is extremely selfish. If you focus on giving it the self, what it desires, what it demands, very little is left. But Umayyad Islam invented and put in the service of that Islam generation upon generation of corrupt scholars who are themselves hypocrites. They invented hadiths, they narrated hadiths, they collected hadiths, all to silence the Quran. But what upheld the Islamic civilization is that there were always a sufficient percentage of people, not a majority, but a sufficient percentage of people that still committed their lives to studying principles, comprehending principles, and implementing principles. And that percentage is what constructed the entire glory of the Islamic civilization. The Islamic civilization crumbled because historical mistakes eventually catch up with you. Like racism caught up with the Roman Empire and eventually brought it down. As racism will eventually catch up with the American civilization. And mark my words, centuries from now, if life it still exists, it will bring it down. The historical mistake eventually caught up with us. To learn not to be selfish is not as easy as you think. Especially that all of us grow up weaned on the Islam of the state, of the Islam that murdered the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ. That's the Islam we're weaned on. Can you imagine? The Islam that we grow up learning, believing in, is the Islam that murdered the grandson of the Prophet. And that Islam teaches you that all you have to do is pay zakat, 2.5%, for whatever you save for over a year, and you're fine. That Islam teaches you, as long as you pray and you fast, and you take care of number one and your family, you're fine. That Islam teaches you that as long as you take care of your feelings and your emotions and your bodies and your body, you're okay. That Islam doesn't get you to marvel at the fact that the greatest creation Allah has given to the universes is the intellect. That Islam doesn't teach you how often Allah emphasized the role of the intellect, the role of moral conscience, the role of justice, the place of justice. That Islam doesn't teach you that if you live your life in the service of yourself, then you're not really a Muslim. You are like the hypocrites of Medina. That if you do not come to the aid of al-mustad'afina fil ard, that if you do not come to the aid of the disempowered and the disinherited, then you are like the munafiqun in Medina. You are like the hypocrites of Medina. But you see, this is the thing. Experiential knowledge, even at the level of experiential knowledge, we now, as Muslims, the experience is undeniable. What is the experience that's undeniable? Is that we keep going from one misery, one tragedy to the next. Since colonialism, Muslims keep going from one tragedy to the next. They are like a people who keep putting their finger in an electric socket and keep getting electrocuted and shocked. Now for centuries. But they keep doing the same thing over and over and over. Experience at the most primitive level. Forget lofty ideas and principles. For centuries now, Muslims keep experiencing one tragedy over the next. At what point do they say, okay, enough is enough? We need to do a very deep dive into our whole historical, moral, intellectual framework. At what point do you say, obviously, the way we are is not working? Obviously, something is really, really, really wrong. How insane is it that we keep going from one disaster to the other, and yet you don't see any massive change in the collective psychology and intellectual dispositions of Muslims. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة والتسليم على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Yes, Muslims keep going from one tragedy to the next. And so much so that since it is clear that the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, insist on not waking up You simply tell yourself, I speak because Allah told me to speak. But I'll speak in the wilderness. So that creation itself can be saturated with the words. From one week to the other, look, yet another book comes out, Worse Than Death, Reflections on the Uyghur Genocide, an extremely painful book by a witness to the genocide. Another book that came out by a scholar called Sean Roberts. The book is titled The War on the Uyghurs, or The War on the Uyghurs. In the book, Sean Roberts documents how President Trump met with the chairman of China and gave him the green light to build the internment camps. Trump met with the president of China and told them, we will condemn you in public, but go ahead, start your Holocaust against Muslims. It is not of concern to the United States. Is this going to wake up the conscience of all the Muslims? Muslims that you love and you respect and you support, that supported the Trump administration, defended the Trump administration, apologized for the Trump administration. Muslims who say, no, Trump is not really an Islamophobe, he's just playing politics. Is the fact that yet another testimonial has come out, an extremely painful testimonial. Is it going to make any difference? Is it going to wake up Muslims? Moral vigilance is a habit. If you become accustomed to putting your own comfort first, of telling yourself, well, you know, I don't ask for that much. You know, aren't I entitled to just this little bit? Well, believe it or not, that's precisely what led us to the Holocaust against the Uyghurs. Another article comes out yet again in a series of articles about how Bosnia is terrified that the genocide against Muslims is going to be reignited. This is an issue that is extremely worrisome because Serbian nationalism and Islamophobia among Serbs and talk of finishing what we started in 96 and finishing the raping and enslaving and murdering of Muslims is at an all-time high. The vast majority of Muslims, for the vast majority of time, oh, we're good people. We do what we can. Another article. A ban on hijab in India. School after school is now banning hijabs in India. Raping, sexually assaulting Muslim women in India has become a pastime of Hindu nationalists. Is that going to wake up Muslims? Is that going to convince Muslims that they're not entitled to the comforts that they demand for themselves? Well, listen to this new disaster, which I have been living with now for the past few days. All of us know that the vast majority of weapons manufactured in the United States, or manufactured by England, or manufactured by France, when these weapons are used, all of us know that they're used in Muslim lands. American missiles, American bombs, British missiles, British bombs, French missiles, French bombs. Where are they used? They are used against Muslims in Muslim lands. And all of us know, as a result, there is a huge displacement of Muslims everywhere. There are Syrian refugees. There are Iraqi refugees. There are Afghani refugees. There are Yemeni refugees. There are Somali refugees. There are Libyan refugees. There are Uyghur refugees. There are Bangladeshi refugees, or the Rohingyas and Burma. Muslim refugees everywhere. The vast majority of these refugees, only Allah knows what happens to them. The vast majority are living in unbelievable, substandard camps, fighting the elements, suffering in silence, dying in silence. Those in camps are the lucky ones. The vast majority of these refugees, although they are refugees because of Western weapons and Western-backed governments, they find themselves fighting for resources, largely in Muslim lands that have grown up weaned on selfishness. The Egyptians say Egypt is for Egyptians. Lock out the Palestinians. Lock out everyone else. Let them die. The Saudis say the same. The Emiratis say the same. Everyone says the same. So the vast majority of these refugees, only Allah knows what happens to them. A good percentage of these refugees are picked up by human traffickers, put into forced labor or sexual slavery. But you're entitled to your comforts. and just a little bit that you want for yourself. Europe, the advanced world, the industrialized world, the world of human rights, in order to save face, gets together under the auspices of the United Nations, and they say, okay, well, we couldn't have bombed the lands of these people. We couldn't have massacred these people. We couldn't have supported whatever goal we have in the countries of these people without a certain percentage of the local population helping us. And so that not all these people are going to think of us as imperial colonial powers, will agree to take a percentage of these refugees. A small percentage of these refugees get to come to the promised land, get to come to the United States, get to immigrate to England, get to immigrate to a European country. The problem, though, is that at the same time you take a percentage of these refugees, what do you do with the experiential self of the racist, colonial, imperial white man? The white man who has colonized the world through the power of racism and is now agreeing to take a small percentage of a people that the white man fundamentally does not respect. After all, these people make me rich, make me comfortable by buying my weapons and killing each other. So you can bet on it that these refugees are going to experience all types of racial discrimination in their new countries where they are supposed to resettle. But one form of discrimination has topped it all for me, has kept me up, awake now, feeling ill for days. A new phenomenon that if it would have happened to any other people, the entire world would be on fire. What is this discrimination? Well, in come the Syrian refugees, Moroccan, Algerian, Somali, Iraqi, and especially in Sweden. Something incredible has happened. There is an intelligence agency that is supposed to focus on national security. This intelligence agency is known as SACO. Well, SACO has been carefully monitoring and spying on Muslims. And SACO, according to public records, has lodged in with social services in Sweden something close to 300,000 complaints. The overwhelming majority if not all of these complaints, are directed at Muslim refugee parents. What are the complaints? Well, if you have a fight with your wife and you yell at her, in come social services. If you don't allow your son or your daughter to date, in come social services. If you object to your daughter wearing a bikini and swimming at school, in come social services. And what have they been doing? In article after article after article, for thousands of Muslim families, they take the children away. They take the children of Syrian families, of Somali families, of Moroccan families away. Apparently, this is big business. Because it's not just racism, but the families that agree to act as foster families get handsomely paid by the state. So these families not just having a financial incentive, but according to a recent book published in Sweden, that when it comes to the children of refugees, social services in Sweden is not particularly discerning. So many of these foster families have turned out to be sexual abusers. They serve the children alcohol and drugs. A percentage of these children end up being sexually abused and sexually assaulted. And although social services tells you that we're taking away your children, and a judge is going to decide, even the United Nations has expressed concern that judges don't believe Muslim parents and don't honor even the desire of Muslim children. I watched a video of a 13-year-old crying and begging to be reunited with his mother. I watched a video of another 13-year-old who was separated, taken from his parents, and when he tried to run away, the police not just arrested him, but the police had stepped with their boots on his head, and the poor child was yelling, "Ashhadu anna la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah." A Moroccan mother called Yasmin, her child was taken away. Yasmin goes on Facebook, records herself in a tearful story. But Yasmin then suffers a nervous breakdown and kills herself. And on YouTube is the video of her son shoveling dirt on her grave. Another child, the woman was not called Yasmin. The woman was called Salwa Lina, a Moroccan woman. Yasmin was someone else. Yasmin was a girl who was separated from her family, a 13-year-old again, and begged and pleaded to be allowed to return to her family. And then she killed herself. A 13-year-old committed suicide. Social services in Sweden now acts like a Gestapo, nabbing the children of Muslims, punishing Muslim families for being Muslim. If you tell your children you ought to remain a virgin, that's cause for removal. If you tell them they can't date, that's cause for removal. If you tell them they can't attend parties, that's cause for removal. If you tell them you want them to pray 5 times a day, that's cause for removal. If you tell them that they have to fast Ramadan, that's cause for removal. Leave alone if you tell them that they should wear the hijab, that's cause for removal. Endemic, widespread, unrestrained racism. Muslim families have lost their children in Italy and in France and in Germany and in Britain. But nothing of the scale of what is taking place in Sweden. But what do you do with the people that look at what's going on in China and they go on with their lives? Do you look at what's bubbling in Bosnia and what is going on in India and the widespread, unchecked racism against Muslims all over the West? And they still talk about what they're entitled to, what they want, what's comfortable for them. It's still a part of their frame of reference. It's still a part of their psychology. For me, you see, an act of selfishness brings down the curse of the unjust murder of Al-Husayn. Allah has forced us to live under the shadow of this high act of immorality. It is as if Allah has said, all of you, there is an event that happened in history that should alert you to the price of egocentrism and selfishness. If you don't realize, if you don't reflect, if you don't comprehend, I would unleash the curse of this event upon you and your entire lifetime. But if you reflect and you understand, then you might be of that minority that actually avoids hypocrisy in living as a Muslim on this earth. And right now, what a small minority it is. What a small minority it is. I don't think I need to say it, but I will, and I'll close with this. The answer, obviously, is not for some idiot to go commit an act of violence, because that only makes things worse, not better. answer if you are incapable of doing anything, if you are incapable of giving money or volunteering for legal representation, or are incapable of influencing politics, or incapable of even the answer, if nothing else, is to get beyond yourself, to teach yourself not to be selfish. At a minimum, you can tell Allah, I couldn't do anything about these children being taken away from their parents in Sweden. But the pain that I felt pushed me to become a better Muslim. A Muslim like the Prophet ﷺ, like Husayn, to live and die by a principle, not in service of the self. May Allah accept. Allahumma afu anna. Allahumma aghfir lana. Allahumma arhamna ya Ali ya Azim. Allahumma tawaffana muslimin. Allahumma ahdina li aqraba min hadha rashada ya Rabb al-alameen. Allah forgive us. Guide us to the straight path. Help us not to be selfish and self-centered, and to live as better Muslims, truer Muslims, more honest, more real as Muslims. وأقم الصلاة ورب